Now, for many of us in Marcellus, the business standard is the paper we read before we start our day, actually. So T.N. Ninan is the chairman of Business Standard Limited. During a quarter century at the helm of different publications, he has been the editor of Business Standard, The Economic Times, and Business World. He was also the executive director at India Today and has been president of the Editors Guild of India, chairman of the Media Committee of the Confederation of Indian Industry. He is the recipient of many awards, including the B.D. Goenka Award of Excellence in Journalism. The Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund awarded him a Nehru Fellowship for 2013 and 2014. He has received his MA in Economics from the University of Madras in 1972. So ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome Mr. Ninan on stage. He's going to talk about what lies ahead for India. Thank you, sir.
You do a presentation, right, sir? You got a presentation loaded here.
Yeah, so got it. Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Saurav, thank you for disturbing my Saturday. If you sit here for the day, you listen to something like 30,000 words, which is like reading half a book. And very often, and I've done this often enough, you go home and wonder what you picked up and what you might remember tomorrow or the day after. And my subject is, which Saurav has given me, is the standard one of economic growth, and a slightly unusual one about states. So I wanted to be minimalist in offering just a very few thoughts, maybe 3 or 4, and maybe 1, or if I'm lucky, 2, may stay with you beyond yet today into tomorrow or the day after. So I don't want to toss a whole number of words and ideas across and do a sort of scattershot. I just want to do a few. So I want to also therefore in that attempt at minimalism, I want to look at underlying structural reasons that look beyond the immediate noise of whatever's going on. So, and I begin with the issue of growth and the context of the last 4 decades. And what you will see is initially a certain flat performance. These are long periods of time, they're whole decades, and these are averages. There are some variations year to year. 5.4% for 1 decade, then 5.6, accelerating to 6.7, and then slowing down in the decade of the 2010s, and I take it up to the pre-COVID year because COVID sort of creates all kinds of distortions. So I don't want to go into the post-COVID period, so I stop actually at 1920. And the average is 6.2. If you take the first COVID year as well, it suddenly drops to 5.7 or 5.8 or something. So I stopped at 1920 to try and catch the long-term trend. And so we have acceleration, first slow, then rapid, and after that some slowing down again. And the question is, what next? And so the first thought, and I'm afraid I'm going to make you work on some numbers through this, but I will lead you through it. So it's better this way, pointing like this. So I want you to focus on the numbers below agriculture and below services. And for the moment, ignore industry. And I'm taking you through 70 years with some intervening decades missing because they don't matter very much in terms of trying to understand what has happened. And what we see is that the share of agriculture in gross value added, which is GDP minus net taxes on goods and services, So the share of agriculture in the 50s was 60% of the total. And it came down slowly, and by the last decade, it had dropped to 19%, so from 60 to 19. And then if you look at services, it's going the other way. Started out at 26 and has gone up to 53. So in many economies, they count construction as part of services. In India, we include it in part of industry. So if you take about 8% from industry and put that into services, services actually become 61%, 61, and industry will drop to about 20%. Out of which, if you take away electricity and mining, actual manufacturing is only about 14-15% and has been like that for more than a decade. So I'll come to the manufacturing story in a bit, but here I'm trying to understand the underlying growth dynamics, because in these three sectors, the growth rates have differed. Agriculture is the slowest growing, industry has grown faster, and the fastest growing has been services. That is why services has acquired a much bigger share of GDP over the decades. Now, what happens when the shares change and the growth rates remain the same? Now, just for illustration, I've taken three growth numbers. I put it in the corner there on the right-hand side top. 3% is for agriculture, 6% is for industry, and 8% is for services, which broadly mirrors what we've been seeing. And if you then assign those services, so 3% growth for 60% of the economy will give you 1.8% for the year, for contribution to overall economy. 6% or 8% at 26 may give you 2%, and so on. So the average with those weighted average for those growth rates works out with the ratio that you have for the 1950s of 60, 14, and 26 gives you 4.72% overall economic growth. As the relative sector share shifts, by 1990, the same growth rates for each sector, meaning the growth rates for the sector don't change, but the growth rate for the economy changes because there is now more services and so on. So 4.72 becomes 5.57 automatically. And if you take it further to 2020, with the new rates that you have, the same growth will give you, the same growth rates, 3, 6, and 8, will now give you 6.5% growth. So what this says is that with the fastest growing sectors having an increasing share, overall growth rate increases. Now, this is fundamental to understanding a basic shift that has taken place in the economy. We become more of a services economy, less of an agriculture economy, and not much increase in actual manufacturing or industry. So with that shift, we're getting, so, Infosys will grow faster than some mining company and so on and so forth. So there is a built-in bias in a developing economy towards more rapid growth, which is the first point we need to understand when looking at growth prospects for the future. There are other structural changes. You went, even in the period when reforms sort of more or less began, literacy was 48% in 1991. By now, it's about 74%. What does that mean? It means that so many more people can read the numbers on a mobile phone, can use a mobile phone, can deal with a bank account, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the capacity is increased because now they are literate. So inevitably, an economy gets more productive. And over 3 decades, that is a substantial shift upwards. Similarly, with tertiary enrollment, I mean, Mohandas Pai just now gave you a whole set of numbers on technical education. But tertiary, which is post-school, higher education, enrollment has gone up, which means so many more engineers, doctors, people capable of doing higher quality work. Can you wait till I finish? And life expectancy has gone up from 59 to about 70. So what did that mean? That if your life expectancy is 59, many people are actually dying during their working age period. So that's a loss of human capacity. If you're living into your 70s and beyond, that means that fewer people are actually dying when they're still productive. And that's a plus for the... So there are underlying socio-economic structural changes, which again underpin the productive capacity of the economy increasing, and therefore you should see logically faster growth. There are other economic policy related issues, openness to trade. All the fastest growing economies in the world through history have grown through trade. We are investing much more than before, but once again there's an interesting dip that takes place. In 2011, the investment rate in fixed capital was 34%. That's dropped in 2023, I've taken the latest year, down to 29%. So the drop in the growth rate that you saw earlier is flowing partly from the fact that we are now investing less than we were 10, 12 years ago. So there is a dip that you see both in the investment rate and in the growth rate. And then there is, I wanted to actually put another slide on this. We all focus on growth. We don't focus that much on stability. For instance, inflation rates have come down. The normal increase in consumer price inflation in decades going through to the 70s and 80s used to be 9 to 10% a year. That was the norm. And wholesale prices used to go up an average of about 7% a year. I mean, they went up and down, but if you took a decade-long average, that is roughly the rate. Today, those would be considered completely unacceptable because the RBI is targeting CPI, consumer price upper band of 6, and an actual target of 4%, which is well below the 10-9% that we used to have. We're actually running at about 6.5%, but it's nowhere near what it used to be. Similarly with wholesale prices. So, I mean, one reflection of this is that the rupee used to depreciate against the dollar by about 5.5% a year in the early decades. That dropped for a couple of decades to an annual drop of about 3.5%. Now we're down to 2.4, 2.5%. And even that 2.4, 2.5% depreciation annually against the dollar is only because the Reserve Bank is buying the dollars. If the Reserve Bank didn't buy the dollars and shore up reserves, the rupee wouldn't actually fall. It would actually be stable against the dollar. Now that is a huge, huge shift from the time that your rupee was depreciating every year against the dollar by 5% or more. So what does that mean? It means that foreign investors find India more attractive because it's no longer a weak currency, or not weak in the way it used to be. The monsoons and oil prices, when you had a bad monsoon with high oil prices, your economy went for a knock completely. In 79-80, when the two combined, GDP actually shrank by 5%, which is what happened in our COVID year, which is seen as a total crisis. 79-80, GDP fell by 5% because there was a bad monsoon and there was a second oil shock. Today, you're having probably a bad monsoon. You have a second oil shock. Energy costs, imported energy costs are 5 to 6%, 5% just for oil, then you have gas, then you have coal. So an sharp energy price increase will almost have the same impact that it had earlier because you're consuming more energy as the economy grows. So on all these fronts, the economy is more stable than it used to be. It's not going to be prone to the kind of shocks that we used to feel in earlier decades. So apart from the structural changes that have underpinned faster growth, we also have an underlying stability issue, which is, I think, a substantial achievement, that the economy is not going through the shocks that you see happening in Argentina or Brazil or Turkey or so many societies and economies We are more stable than before. So these are fundamental changes in the way the economy is working. And now I come to this great manufacturing issue. So far I made only one point to you, which are the structural changes in the economy are helping you to become more productive and grow faster. So logically, if the previous 2 decades we had growth rates of 6.7 and 6.2, we should now be able to do about 6.5 at least. If we don't, then something's gone wrong. And this is the question that Saurabh posed to me: do we have the capacity to up our growth rate? And my answer is we should logically expect it to be growing faster. If we don't, then something's being mishandled. Now I come to this whole manufacturing issue. In 2011 or 12, the then UPA government put out what it called a new manufacturing policy, which basically said that they wanted to double the share of manufacturing in GDP in 10 years. Now mathematically that is impossible, because you can't take 14% of the economy and want to make it 28% of a much larger economy. Then you would have to be trebling or quadrupling your economy, your manufacturing sector in 10 years. I mean, it just doesn't happen. And of course it didn't happen. In fact, nothing happened. Then you came to 2015, when the NDA government basically repackaged the program with the same sectoral numbers to say they would double manufacturing again by the year 2022. Same year, same numbers. Again, nothing happened. Now we are seeing this whole productivity-linked incentives and all kinds of capital subsidies being offered to somehow try and make manufacturing happen within the country. And I want to point to the underlying structural problem that we face, which many people know about, and sort of, for all I know, may have written about it, because it's not a secret, it's well known in economic circles, which is that we are not able to compete on manufacturing exports because of our success in services exports. Services exports, the TCS and the Infosys and all the others of the world are actually killing manufacturing exports. Why? If you start with 2000, 2001, and you look at goods exports, which is $45.5 billion, and the trade balance on goods was 12.5 billion negative. Invisibles in the same year. Now, invisibles is a much broader term than just software services or business services. It includes a lot of other things. So, invisibles were $32 billion, and had in invisibles, we had a net positive balance of 9.8. So, the current account, as it's called, which combines the first and the second categories, was 12.5 minus 9.8 plus. Net balance was negative 2.7. And then you had net capital inflows of 8.5 billion. So at the end of the day, you had a balance of payments surplus of 5.9 billion. Now you see what has happened. In goods exports, you have a huge deficit. But on your overall balance of payments, because of invisibles, which are basically services, and capital flows, you are surplus. And the foreign exchange reserves, which were about I think $2 or $3 billion 10 years earlier, 1991, had become $42 billion because of this trend. Now, what does this do? If you had a $12 billion deficit on your trade, what would normally happen is that, and that was the only thing you exported, only merchandise, you would have had the rupee falling to a level low enough to make your manufacturing sector internationally competitive. Now, it did not happen because you actually, at the end of the day, have a surplus. So it holds up the rupee. And therefore, manufacturing, which needs a cheaper rupee to succeed overseas, doesn't get that cheaper rupee. It gets a more expensive rupee. So how do you compete in that situation? And that story has persisted for 2 decades. In 2010-11, goods exports had grown to 256 billion, and the goods export, the trade negative, the trade deficit was 127, huge. But invisibles are 190, and the surplus on invisibles was 79. And then you had capital flows, so you had a net surplus of $13 billion in 1 year. And what was $42 billion reserves 10 years later had become $300 billion because the RBI is buying up the dollars to somehow keep the rupee down. They don't want the rupee to climb because it will kill manufacturing even more. So now you're building up reserves. And you take the latest set, it's broadly the same story. Exports have grown further, so has the trade deficit, so has invisibles, and the invisible balance now is $150 billion. Capital flows are even stronger than before, and you therefore have a payment surplus of $47 billion in 1 year, and your reserves have doubled to $600 billion. So in this scenario, you cannot have a cheap rupee. And if the Reserve Bank tries to buy up so many dollars that it pushes the rupee down even more, then immediately the US comes down on you because they have their laws which force them to take action against what they call currency manipulators. And if they see us as being a currency manipulator and they put us on a watch list for being a currency manipulator for forcibly trying to keep the rupee down. So if the Reserve Bank does any more, you will actually be categorized as a currency manipulator and they will take action against you. So there are limits beyond which the Reserve Bank cannot move to keep the rupee down and build up reserves. So in this scenario, the manufacturing sector is a primary victim because it cannot compete with a strong currency. And services exports, and the success of services exports makes a weak currency impossible. So this is why whatever attempts we made to make manufacturing succeed will not work, because the structure of the economy is such that we built up a services success story, which now impinges on manufacturing. So now, therefore, what the government is doing now is actually it's not a particularly attractive policy option, but it is now the only policy option left, which is to say that we will increase tariffs to protect the home market, which they've done. So average tariffs since 2017 or 18 have gone up by 5 percentage points, and we are now probably 3 times the world average on tariffs. The second thing that they are doing is to offer incentives and subsidies to make the home market more of a production center. You have to wait till I finish, okay? Thank you. So in this process, you are creating distortions because we've tried import substitution before, and it led to a high-cost economy which could not compete. It was a hothouse atmosphere. It could not compete when the tariff walls came down. So if you are creating an inefficient industrial sector through these subsidies and tariff protections, then the danger is that history could repeat itself. The government insists that it won't repeat itself because they're conscious of the issue and that they are also asking these companies which are coming to invest here to do some exports, so they have to be internationally competitive. If it works out that way, very good. If it doesn't, then you have a problem. But given the dichotomy between manufacturing and services, that is really the only option. There is no other way that manufacturing will grow in this country, except in sectors where labor cost is not an issue because Bangladesh and Vietnam and all are much cheaper. And some kinds of manufacturing, like pharmaceuticals or automobiles, have specific issues where it helps them succeed. But across the board, it's hard to make manufacturing succeed in the way that East Asia did in an earlier age. So when people talk about making manufacturing a success, do please remember that this is an underlying structural problem the Indian economy has, which is my second point for your consideration. I have what, 5-10 minutes more? Okay, I mean, you said half an hour, so I'll go through this. Okay, so this, in a sense, this answers the first set of questions that sort of posed to me about growth and how I see the future. One other element which is there is the fact that the whole world is now actually slowing down. Everybody is putting up tariff walls. Trade will suffer. this automatically makes economies less efficient, and therefore growth will suffer, and every country will feel the pinch. And we are going through a cycle where this now seems inevitable, and this is going to play itself out. So in that environment, how this will work for us, we remain to see. But it's the same game that the US is playing, it's the same game that the Europeans are playing, it's the same game that everybody's playing. So if that's the name of the game, we play it. Then there is a question that sort of asked me about states. And the issue for him was how important are state governments compared to what the central government is. And there is an issue that's waiting for us around the corner, which is 2026. For those who are not familiar with the issue, the background is that every decade after the census, the number of seats in parliament would be adjusted, and the relative number of seats different states got would be adjusted into what is called delimitation to accommodate the population changes. So if a state now had a larger population, it may get 1 or 2 more MPs. Somebody that had one smaller population because they're better at family planning would get 1 or 2 seats less. So there were actually fairly small adjustments that were being made. And then in 1971, I think, there was a change where they said they'll hold it steady for a while. And in 2001, the Vajpayee government said, we will not change the number of seat allocations for each different states for 25 years. That's up to 2026. Because the southern states have done better, and they should, in family planning, and they should not be penalized for their success by having fewer MPs. And the northern states will get much more MPs because they failed on family planning. So they said to prevent north-south issues, they said we will freeze this for 25 years. That 25 years ends in 2026. And the specific constitutional amendment said that the next delimitation will be will follow the census numbers of the first census done after 2026. After 2026, which means 2027. Now, a lot of people suspect that the real reason why the 2021 census has not been done as yet is that the government wants to actually do it after 2026 to then change the parliamentary seat allocation, because the northern states will get many more seats, and that's their political base, and they will then be permanently locked into power. This is a suspicion that people have. We don't know if it's true, but this is going to be a source of tension, because in the normal course, you'd have had to wait till the census of 2031, and then in 2032, set up a new delimitation commission, which would take a year, and the constitution of the Lok Sabha would then actually change only in 2033. So we don't know when exactly this change will happen, but certainly within the next decade, the delimitation of seats will have to happen. To set the stage for what that could mean politically, let's look at the economy. Over 40 years, the share of the 5 southern states in the national net domestic product, 5 southern states were originally 4, but Andhra got split. So you have Telangana, Andhra, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala, 5 states. The share of those 5 states in national net domestic product was 15.8%. In 2023, that's gone up to 30.85%, it's doubled. So the share of the southern economy in the national economy has doubled over 40 years. They've done very well. So what does that tell you about per capita income as a consequence? You look at the southern states and you'll see that, let's take the highest, Telangana is 3.09 lakh annual income per head. Compare that to Bihar at the top on the rest, half a lakh. Telangana has 6 times the per capita income of Bihar. Karnataka is at 3.01 lakh, UP is at 0.71 lakh. Karnataka has more than 4 times the per capita income of UP. Tamil Nadu has twice Chhattisgarh, and so on and so forth. But these are all in the 2 to 3 lakh range in the south, and over there, they are in the half lakh to 1.5 lakh range. So overall, it's a ratio of around 2:1. And in some states, as you've seen, some states comparison is 6:1. So when the states have done well, you can see that income now showing, and if anybody from the north travels to the south, they all come back and say, boss, this is a different country. They go and look at Bangalore, and they go and look at Hyderabad, and then they see the quality of life in some of the smaller southern towns and say, boss, this is just unimaginable. So 40 years of the south doing better, this is what is the end product. So clearly, if we are one country, this is not, you can't tolerate this. These inequalities in the same political system will not hold. You have to do something about it. And what have they been doing? These are some other indicators. Life expectancy in the south is 70 to 75, and the rest is 65 to 70. Fertility in the south is now actually less than, so the southern populations are going to start declining across the board, because you need a fertility rate of at least 2, because there are 2 parents. So you need a woman to produce at least 2 children in her lifetime for it to be replacement level, which means 0 population growth. You need 2 kids. Then the south is down to 1.5. So the southern population is actually going to decline over a certain time period. There is an overhang of earlier fertility issues, so it will take 10 or 15 years. But within 10 and Kerala and Tamil Nadu are already declining, I think. So across the south, you will start seeing the population declining. The kind of situation that you're seeing in China, or which you saw earlier in Japan, which you see across Europe. So that's now waiting for us in the south. But in the north, you're still getting 2.5 to 3 kids per woman. So, so the population is going to get larger. Income is going to be distributed in larger numbers. Per capita income will drop. The north is in any case growing more slowly. So you are sort of hardwiring in growing inequality between north and south into the system with these structural issues. And then there are differences in literacy and all the rest. So you can't ignore this problem. You have to do something about it. So you see what the government is doing. The government distributes central taxes to the states, and the sharing ratio among the different states is decided every 5 years by the Finance Commission. On the GST, is decided by the GST Council. So I just wanted to show you one example of this, that the southern states contribute a quarter of the total GST contribution in the first 5 months of this year. But what is in the budget for this year, what is the share of distribution that the southern states will get out of central taxes and duties? 15%, 16%. So you are taking money, that is tax money, that is being contributed by the south and giving it to the north, because you're giving back less than to the south than you're taking from it. So by definition, you are giving more to the north than you're getting from it. Now, I agree with this. I think this is what we should do, because how else do you equalize these states which have such radical differences now? And if you look at the state's own resources, the western and southern states per head will have multiples of their state's own revenue. These are central transfers. The state's own revenue, you look at Bihar, it's pathetic. They have no revenue because there are no manufacturing, no industry. What are they going to produce revenue from? You look at Odisha. Odisha has, of course, large, extraction industry, so they are better off. So is Jharkhand. But the point is that if you don't transfer money from the south to the north through the federal fiscal system, you are not going to be able to address the imbalances. So this is a political imperative growing from what has happened to the economy over the last 5 years, over the last 40 years. Then we come to the political issue flowing from population. In 1971, which is when you more or less froze seat allocation in the Lok Sabha, the South had 24.6% of the population and 24.3% of the seats. Everybody is equal. By 2023, the share of population for the South had dropped to 19.6, but they still have 24% of the share of seats. Now, if you wanted to equalize this and say that population must be mirrored equally in the seats allocation in the Lok Sabha, you would, out of 543 seats, which you have today, you would have to increase it by 120 seats to take it up to 663. And the southern states would get none of those seats. All 120 seats would go to the other states, 20 plus states, and you would get a house size of 663, and the South would be back to 19.6%, which is the share of the population. So, but what happens? You're going to expand the size of the House by more than 20%, and it's all going to go to the North. All the new MPs are going to come from the North. So, if you were in the South, you will say, boss, first you take my taxes and give it to somebody else. Now you're robbing me of my political capacity. So this is very clearly a tinderbox. And you have to deal with it very carefully because correctives are required. But how do you go about it? So I have some thoughts, which is that you have to give the South some reason for not protesting. What can you say? You can say that there will be greater devolution of power to states and give them increased autonomy so they feel they are more in control of their affairs. You could say that there will be no further change for 25 years, for the next 25 years, because the southern population is going to decline. So this could get even worse. And if you review it after another 25 years, the South may feel it has even less of a say in national affairs. You could keep the Rajya Sabha seats unchanged and say those are seat allocations. It's a council of states. So it's not a population-centric thing, which it is at the moment, but we can say it, like the US Senate. Every state has two senators. And the state with 2 million population will have 2 senators, the state with 50 million population will have 2 senators. So you could say that Rajya Sabha will not change the seat allocation. So you still have a quasi-veto on what you feel you may lose out in the Lok Sabha by having some kind of block. But it's not a real block because you only have 1/4 of the seats anyway. So it's not an effective block, but that's one option you can have. You could give them assurances on language policy, which is traditionally, again, a flashpoint. And you could give some substance to this phrase, cooperative federalism, meaning you have to find some way to get the South to accept that this change is required. So when you look at South, North, Center, State issues, I want to leave this one thought with you, that you have inequalities that have grown over 40 years. Those inequalities have to be addressed, but how you address them will depend on whether the change goes through successfully or not. You're already doing the fiscal correction, you need to do the political correction, but how do you do it? Because the average constituency in Bihar has got twice the number of voters as the average constituency in Kerala. Now, how can you accept that? Meaning a Bihar vote is only half a Kerala vote, So you have to do something about it, but the question is how? And I just hope that whichever government has to deal with this issue, when they come to deal with it, will deal with it in a manner that will not create further tensions and stresses, and create a solution rather than create a problem. So just 3 thoughts, and I hope they will stay with you beyond today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Can we have the chairs on stage, please? Yes. I invite Salil also on stage along with Saurabh. Just turn the slide off. That's one mic. One more mic.
So it's very interesting, right? We as investors are trying to make money from the South, blissfully oblivious to the political challenges of dealing with the South. I think making money from the south will potentially be easier. Making money, for us to make money from the south, for you to make money from the south, I think will be easier than for whoever is running the country to deal with the delimitation issue. So somebody at a higher pay grade has to deal with the more complex issue. So please get your questions over in those flashcards.
We have a few questions already to start with, so Salil
Okay.
will take those. Meanwhile, any of you who have questions, please write it down on the cue card.
So just read it out and give the flashcard to Ninan sir.
Right.
You can mention those on the cue cards. We'll definitely come back to you with them. Thank you.
Right, so this clarification is about.
That many questions?
Yeah, no, not that. So, how do you define invisibles? Is it just remittances or sale of services? Or?
Everything. Business services, tech services, tourism, aviation.
Remittances,
Yes, and remittances also. So they're all invisible flows. Right. Meaning nothing is, goods or merchandise crossing
Ninan
the
sir,
border.
I'll hold the notes. Just hold the mic closer. Just hold the mic closer. I'll just hold the notes. Yeah.
Okay.
So question is on invisibles. What Ninan sir was saying is invisibles is everything from tourism, tourists coming to India, to IT services being exported from India, to fund managers like us managing money for foreign investors. So invisibles is the whole gamut.
It could be royalty payments, it could be dividend payouts.
Remittances are included, sir.
Yeah. And capital is different.
Yes, so remittances are included.
But returns on capital, like royalty payments and all are in current payments. So that's why the current account includes everything. And the capital account is where the capital is. Then you do an overall balance of payments.
So let me just explain why we wanted Ninan sir to speak, right? Normally, whose views do you hear in the newspapers? You hear macro views from brokerage analysts, right? Whose knowledge of economics is modest, but who also have a vested interest in giving you hyped up forecasts. India story, 8%. Why 8%? Why stop at 8%? You can also say 9%, right? That's the kind of macro forecast we are accustomed to, right? People who have a vested interest in hyping up all sorts of stories, right? What we thought is let's get someone who's seen India over 40 years and who has no vested interest. I don't think Ninan sir has any vested interest in hyping up India ka GDP growth and getting you to invest your hard-earned money. And from his balanced perspective, from his perch in as the business standard editor for the best part of 4 decades, what he's saying is, basis what he can see, 6.5% growth, 6.5% growth, perhaps a little better, should be very doable for a long period of time. Now what that's telling you is, if 6.5% is growth, maniye inflation is around 4-5%, that means nominal GDP growing at around 11%. Should be very doable. That means a decent company, a company of the sort we invest in, should be able to grow revenues at say 12-13% pretty consistently for a long period of time. Right? I stress this just to think through why we do this. We're not here to give you some GDP forecast so that you go home and say India acha karega. That's the least of our intentions. We want to give you a rational perspective on desh mein kya hoga. Rational perspective should be when you wake up in the morning, rather than panicking or getting euphoric, neither panic nor euphoria, you can take a rational perspective and say, acha company, well-run company, 12-13% se revenues grow karega. If they are reasonably efficient, as they get bigger, the profit margin should improve. So 15-16% profit growth aega. And as they reduce their working capital cycle, 19-20% cash flow growth aega, right? So that was the first reason. Second thing that Ninan sir said was, and second thing that Ninan sir is telling you is, this country is far more stable today. It's far more stable today from an economic standpoint than it was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. He cited the monsoons. Purane zamane mein monsoons were bad and oil prices went up. Country would get screwed. GDP growth would be -5. 1979 was a -5% year. Just to put 1979 in context, he told you that COVID ka first wave was a -5% year. In the Purana Zamana, we didn't need COVID. Bad monsoon and high oil price was equal to COVID, right? Now, today, this year, right now, we seem to have a baddish monsoon because August was the driest August in 120 years. We've had the driest August in 120 years. I'm not seeing anybody panic. We haven't had sales. Has anybody called you saying it's the driest August in 120 years? Bej du kya? We haven't had people calling up, right? It's a good thing. Secondly, oil prices are hitting 90. We aren't seeing panicky investors calling us up. Neither are we seeing the stock market plunge. And what he's telling you is this is a measure of how much more stable the country has become. So leave aside people coming on financial news channels and giving you hype and brokers creating false hype. From a rational thinker's perspective, this country is set for an extended period of sensible growth, and this country has become a far more stable economy. From that standpoint, you need to think about your investments, right? From where I sit, if I'm living in a country which is stable and which will do reasonably well on economic growth, investing in good quality stocks should be a sensible standpoint, rather than asking me or asking yourself, abhi ghusu ya kal ghusu ya parso ghusu, when should I enter the market, right? If you're living in a stable country with healthy economic growth, the timing piece and trying to second guess, agle 5 din mein kya hoga stock market mein, trying to second guess that becomes less relevant. So that's the context in which we thought we will get Ninan sir's thoughts. And as I stress again, the Business Standard is a great newspaper. In fact, this morning's edit piece from Ninan sir, again, Saturdays ko likhte hain. Other days of the week he doesn't write, if you can convince him otherwise. On that point about him writing, we've got some of his books here. He's written a superb book on the Indian economy. If you want an autographed copy, I think there's some copies. Zara khol ke rakho. If nobody else takes one, I'll certainly take one. I've got a copy at home, but I'll also take advantage in true Marcellus style and get an autographed copy. Salil, back to you.
Right. So there are a lot of questions on the South versus the rest debate. Right. So first is, this looks like our HR gets a lot of complaint that a person who does better gets more work to do, right? So South is in a way, you're getting punished for actually doing better.
The South now has an inbuilt advantage.
So how long does this sustain? Does the rest, which is lower base, grow faster than the South, or these structural fundamentals are so strong in the South that it's unlikely the rest ever catch up?
Okay, on present reckoning, I would be very surprised if the North started doing better than the South. The South has a coastline on both sides. Yep. It has the human resources that the North simply doesn't. We don't realize that 30-40 million people have migrated. 30-40 million.
Wow.
Okay, that's like half the population of Britain has migrated from the east to the west and the south. I come from Kerala. I've never lived there, but I visited Kerala just a few months ago, and I found that the state's population is about 3% of India's population, is about 40 million. There are some 4 million outside India, and there are 4 million who've come from East India to work in Kerala. And people are building special housing for them because, they don't know the language. They just come and work in the fields or work around the house or whatever.
And just speak into the mic. Just speak.
Okay,
into the, yeah.
sorry. So there is a lot of internal migration taking place, and this has become a remittance economy because they send the money back home to their homes. So what the Keralites did by sending money from the Gulf to Kerala, these workers are doing by sending money back home. So you could argue that migration is always part of a solution. Internal migration can help mitigate. But given the way the South, you look at the focus of the Southern Chief Ministers, each guy is trying to compete to outdo the other. BRS, Chandrasekhar Rao, wants to do better than Andhra, he wants to do better than Karnataka. And you will see in some states, some ways now that Telangana actually, and Hyderabad is doing better than some of the other southern cities. Chennai wants to be an auto and electronic manufacturing center. So does Karnataka, so does Andhra. They're all competing to set up more and more things. So, And they are intensely focused on trying to make it happen. And they are, so you don't see that same single-minded focus in the north, except possibly in UP, where I think he's really determined to do something. And I think the center is determined to try and make an example of UP, that we can make this state work. So they're planning the defense corridor, the electronics corridor, and so on. Like Haryana, UP has a great advantage of bordering Delhi. So the whole Noida, Greater Noida segment is a growth engine in the way that Gurgaon and Faridabad have been for Haryana. So because of Gurgaon, Haryana's per capita income is way ahead of Punjab. I mean, just think about it. Haryana is semi-arid, and Punjab is a granary and small manufacturing town of India. But Haryana is now way ahead. Why? Gurgaon. So UP has Noida. So I think UP would be a better success story than Bihar or Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh or maybe even Rajasthan.
That's interesting because sitting in Bombay, the only thing you read are full-page ads from the UP government on.
Yeah, I think they're intent on making it work in UP. So.
So the next question is from somebody who identifies as TOS. So between, say, South and the rest, if you split the rest also into, say, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Haryana, how divergent are growth numbers there?
They won't lose in the way the South will in terms of political representation. That won't happen because their populations have also grown. They may lose some. There will be interstate variations. Kerala will lose much more than any southern state and so on. So each state will have its own set of issues. But I don't see the West facing, per capita income in the West is of course high. Yeah. Gujarat and Maharashtra compare well with the South. And the migration is also to the West. But I don't think they will lose politically in the Lok Sabha representation in quite the same way.
Right. And there's a question from Jaybir. Given the political implications of the delimitation that coming through, does the government take the easy way out and just not do anything in 2026, or are they bound by certain rules to follow?
No, in 2001 they were supposed to change it after the 2001 census. Right. So the Vajpayee government bought time and passed a constitutional amendment saying, and I think it was unanimously passed, saying we will defer this for 25 years. I would very much doubt that this government would want to do that, defer it again. Number one, I think it's not correct. You do have to correct the political imbalance where one Bihar vote is equal to only half the value in terms of representation of a Kerala vote. You have to equalize it. So something has to be done. The point is, how will you do it in a manner that does not create a serious problem, a bigger problem?
Right. Continuing on this same topic, like Mr. Srinivasan asked that if the BJP were to return to power in 24, right, would it be fair to conclude that the Southern Five would face both fiscal as well as political setbacks because there's a subsidy which is going from there to the other parts of the country? Do the southern states have some sort of a revenue shortfall if...
Yeah, you could get polarization. The BJP has a significant presence in the south only in Karnataka.
Right.
It doesn't really work anywhere else. So, they could get permanently disadvantaged in Karnataka, but then they would get a permanent long-term advantage in the north. So, you will get a serious political divide below the, not quite the Vindhyas, because Maharashtra is mostly below the Vindhyas, but lower down. I'll try and look at it as more of north of the Godavari and south of the Godavari. Because the Godavari starts in Nasik and wends its way down towards eastern Andhra Pradesh. So in a sense, it captures much more of the 5 southern states as a geography, rather than saying south of the Vindhyas, because even part of Gujarat is south of the Vindhyas, so. And parts of Madhya Pradesh as well, so.
Sorry, we'll have time for just one last question is, on a similar note, right, so Bangalore, for example, is thriving, right? This question comes from Gaurav, but infrastructure is quite terrible, right? Is it likely that the southern states will actually need more support from the center to, build out their infrastructure, which is probably, creaking at the edges?
You see, you have to look at the southern states' own resources, which is much higher than the north and eastern states' own resources, tax resources, meaning what they can collect on their own. Half of what you collect is GST, meaning apart from the IGST, the interstate GST, the center GST and state GST are equal. And so whatever the state collects, it keeps. What they collect as central GST, they have to hand over, which then gets redistributed in that 15% ratio that I showed. Right. So, if Bihar has 1 rupee as tax revenue, I haven't looked at the details recently, I've looked at it in the past. The southern states may have 3 to 4 times that. Yeah. So they have a built-in advantage, right, because it's built up advantage over 40 years. That I now am wealthier, my people spend more money, I get more tax resources, I can tax them more. I can tax them more. So that inbuilt advantage will not be easily neutralized, even if the center gives still more money to the north.
So just to be clear, Bangalore's poor infrastructure is not due to lack of money, right? Karnataka has plenty of money. I mean, as Ninan sir is explaining, Karnataka fiscal situation, Karnataka and Telangana is not too different, right? So Hyderabad has brilliant infrastructure. Bangalore's infrastructure has got nothing to do with lack of money. Bangalore doesn't need Delhi to give money to Bangalore for infrastructure. And I think it's going to stay like that for a while. Bangalore's lack of infrastructure is for a bunch of reasons. We can do a separate session with Mohandas Pai on Bangalore's infrastructure. Right? Am I correct in saying that, sir? Bangalore's infrastructure, the rickety nature of Bangalore's infrastructure has got nothing to do with lack of money.
None of our cities, not one of our cities, right, faces money as a primary problem. I mean, Sheila Dikshit used to tell me in Delhi over and over again, and Kejriwal said the same thing, that money is the last of my problems. The amount of money that Bombay Municipal Corporation spends is more than the money of some states. Okay? And the point is, how is that money spent? You live here, what is your property tax? It's nothing. If you simply had reform of property tax, Bombay's revenue would double. Bangalore can do the same thing. Cities are full of money, they're always full of money. It's a question of how you govern it.
So I think that's a good note with which to end with Mr. Ninan. Modern India's problems, money is not a problem in modern India, and taxpayers' money certainly not a problem. And especially if you're from South India, several of you are. In South India, certainly money is not an issue.
The issue that Chandrababu Naidu caught on to 30 years ago was that you have to build an urban center that is a magnet. Then you have to build an airport that makes it a transit hub. You do these two things, people will come and investment will come, and that is what has happened.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much. Privilege having you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
We got a hamper box. It's really heavy, so we'll help you carry that. We'll take a picture, sir. Really heavy.